Freedom is not the power to control life. It is the power to not be ruled by what life does to you. Epictetus saw this before the modern world learned how to disguise its slavery. Before self-help became an industry, before psychology gave names to inner conflict, he had already stripped the human condition to its hardest truth. A person can be chained in body and still remain inwardly free. A person can possess status, comfort, admiration, and still live as a servant to fear. This is what makes Epictetus unbearable to the weak and indispensable to the honest. He does not flatter pain. He does not promise rescue. He draws a line. Some things belong to you. Some things never will. And your entire life will be shaped by whether you can face that line without resentment. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. The modern person still suffers from the same ancient confusion. Even in 2025, we still hand our peace to events, to outcomes, to the opinions of others. We still confuse possession with stability. We still expect the world to obey our emotional needs. Epictetus confronts that illusion without mercy. So the real question is not whether life is fair, it is whether you can remain sovereign when it is not. That is where his philosophy begins, and that is the threshold we now cross into the deeper architecture of his thought, where freedom, judgment, discipline, and human dignity will be tested one layer at a time. Chapter 1. Freedom begins within. Freedom is not where you think it is. It does not live in circumstances, power, or the ability to control the world. It hides in a place most people ignore, inside the boundary of the self. Epictetus saw this with a clarity that cuts through illusion. A man born into slavery understood freedom more deeply than those who believed themselves free. That is not a contradiction. That is an exposure. Before the modern world equated freedom with choice, status, and external mobility, Epictetus had already drawn a harder line. While others believed freedom meant expanding control over life, he saw that control itself was limited, brutally limited. And instead of denying this, he built his philosophy on it. He began with a distinction that most people avoid because it is too severe. There are things that belong to you, and there are things that never will. This is where the illusion begins to break. You do not control your body completely. You do not control your reputation. You do not control the actions of others. You do not control the outcomes of your efforts. Yet you build your identity on these unstable grounds. You tie your sense of self to things that can be taken, altered, or destroyed without your consent. And then you call it life. Epictetus calls it dependence. So where is freedom? It is not in what happens to you. It is in how you respond to what happens. Not as a slogan, but as a structure of existence. The Stoics called it prohairesis, the faculty of choice. The inner capacity to decide your attitude, your judgment, your stance toward reality. This is the only domain that cannot be directly violated by the external world. Everything else can be touched, shaped, broken. This cannot, unless you surrender it. This is the first brutal truth. A person can be chained and still be free. A person can have everything and still be enslaved. Because freedom is not measured by what you possess, but by what possesses you. If your peace depends on external conditions, then you are owned by those conditions. If your identity depends on recognition, then you are controlled by those who give or withdraw it. Epictetus strips away every comfortable definition and replaces it with one that cannot be negotiated. Freedom is self-command. This does not mean control over emotions in the naive sense. It means awareness of what is yours to command and what is not. It means refusing to place your dignity in unstable territory. It means building your life on something that cannot be taken by force, loss, or accident. This is not optimism. It is discipline. People misunderstand this immediately. They think it is resignation. They think it is passivity. They imagine a philosophy that tells you to accept everything and do nothing. This is weak thinking. Epictetus does not tell you to stop acting. He tells you to act with clarity about what your action can and cannot guarantee. He removes illusion, not effort. You can act, but you cannot control results. You can choose your intention, but not how the world responds. You can speak, but not decide how others interpret your words. And once this is understood, a new form of strength appears. Not the strength of domination, but the strength of alignment. You stop fighting reality where it cannot be changed. You stop demanding certainty where it does not exist. You redirect your energy toward what is actually within your reach. This shift is small in language, but massive in consequence. Because most suffering does not come from events themselves, it comes from the refusal to accept their limits. You want control where there is none. You want permanence in what is temporary. You want certainty in a world structured by change. And when reality refuses, you call it unfair. Epictetus calls it misunderstanding. Now bring this into the modern world. In 2025, the illusion of control is stronger than ever. Technology gives the impression that everything can be managed, optimized, predicted. You can track your health, your productivity, your social presence. You can shape your environment in ways previous generations could not imagine. And yet, anxiety increases. Why? Because control has expanded outward, but not inward. You can influence more variables, but you still cannot control outcomes. You still cannot prevent loss. You still cannot guarantee meaning. And the more you believe you should be able to, the more fragile you become when reality resists. Epictetus cuts through this illusion. He reminds you that no expansion of external control will ever replace internal mastery. You can build systems, but you cannot eliminate uncertainty. You can accumulate resources, but you cannot secure identity through them. The modern individual is not suffering from lack of control. They are suffering from misunderstanding where control ends. This leads into the deeper psychological layer. Why is it so difficult to accept this boundary? Because the ego wants to be sovereign over everything. It wants to believe that effort guarantees outcome. That desire creates fulfillment. That intention shapes reality. These beliefs create a sense of power, but they are fragile, because when reality breaks them, the self collapses with them. Epictetus removes this false sovereignty. He forces the individual to confront a more limited but more stable form of power, the power to choose one's response. This is not dramatic. It does not feel grand, but it is real. And because it is real, it can be relied upon. Look closely at what this means. You cannot stop pain from entering your life, but you can decide whether pain becomes suffering. You cannot prevent loss, but you can decide whether loss destroys your identity. You cannot control how others see you, but you can decide whether their judgment defines you. This is not theory, this is practice. And practice is where most people fail, because understanding this once is not enough. The mind returns to its old patterns. It reaches outward for control. It attaches itself to unstable things. It forgets the boundary and then suffers when the boundary asserts itself again. Epictetus does not offer a one-time realization. He offers a discipline, a repeated return to the same distinction. What is mine, what is not, what I can shape, what I must accept. This repetition is not weakness. It is the only way to rewire the instinct that constantly pulls the mind outward. Now consider the existential consequence. If freedom is internal, then no one can give it to you, and no one can take it from you unless you allow it. This removes every excuse. You cannot blame circumstances entirely. You cannot wait for conditions to improve before becoming free. The responsibility is immediate, and this is where many resist. Because external lack of freedom is visible, it creates sympathy. Internal lack of freedom is invisible. It demands accountability. It forces you to admit that much of your suffering is not imposed, but constructed through attachment, expectation, and misjudgment. Epictetus does not soften this. He makes it sharper. He shows that dignity is not something granted by the world. It is something maintained by the self. And once you understand this, your relationship with life changes. You stop asking for guarantees. You stop demanding fairness as a condition for peace. You begin to operate from a different center. This center is not invulnerability. It is clarity. You still feel, you still act, you still engage with the world, but you no longer confuse what you can influence with what you cannot control. And this distinction becomes a form of stability that does not depend on external conditions. Through Epictetus, we see a human being stripped of illusion, not elevated above suffering, but no longer defined by it, not protected from change, but no longer broken by it. This is the real meaning of inner freedom, not the absence of constraint, but the refusal to be owned by what lies outside your command. And once this is seen clearly, the question becomes unavoidable. If your freedom depends only on what is within you, why do you keep giving it away? Why do you attach your peace to what you cannot hold? Why do you build your identity on what can be taken at any moment? There is no answer that can hide from this, because the boundary is already there. You either live within it consciously, or you suffer against it unconsciously. And at the moment you finally stop demanding control over what is not yours, something shifts. Not in the world, in you. And that is where freedom begins. Chapter 2. What truly belongs to you. This is where illusion collapses into a single brutal line. Not everything in your life belongs to you. Not your body, not your reputation, not your success, not even the people you love. Epictetus does not soften this truth. He sharpens it until there is no place left to hide. Because until you understand what is yours and what is not, you will live in permanent conflict with reality. Before the modern world began to preach control, achievement, and self-creation as if they were absolute, Epictetus had already exposed the limit of all human power. While others encouraged expansion, he demanded distinction. Not more control, but clearer boundaries. He saw that suffering does not begin with pain. It begins with confusion about ownership. This confusion is everywhere. You say your job is yours, yet it can be taken. You say your body is yours, yet it can weaken, age, collapse. You say relationships are yours, yet they can change, dissolve, disappear. And still you build your identity on these unstable things. You anchor your sense of self to what is fundamentally outside your command. This is not ignorance. It is attachment disguised as certainty. Epictetus introduces a division that is simple in words, but devastating in consequence. Some things are within your control, others are not. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, these belong to you. External events, outcomes, opinions of others, these do not. This is not a philosophical idea to admire. It is a structure you must live inside. And most people refuse to live inside it. They reach beyond their boundary. They demand control over what cannot be controlled. They expect stability from what is inherently unstable. And when reality refuses, they call it suffering. But Epictetus does not call it suffering. He calls it error. This is the first fracture. Pain is inevitable. Loss is inevitable. Change is inevitable. But the suffering that follows is not always caused by the event itself. It is caused by the belief that the event should not have happened, that it violated something that was yours. But what if it was never yours to begin with? This question is not comforting, because it removes the foundation of most human expectations. You expect people to remain, they leave. You expect success to last, it fades. You expect recognition to be stable, it shifts. And each time you experience it as injustice. But Epictetus forces you to confront a harder possibility. You are demanding permanence from what was always temporary. This is where suffering grows, not from reality itself, but from the refusal to accept its structure. Now consider what happens when the boundary becomes clear. If something is not within your control, you stop tying your peace to it. You still engage, you still act, but you no longer demand a specific outcome as a condition for stability. Your effort remains, but your dependence dissolves. This is not indifference, it is precision. Most people cannot make this shift because they believe that caring requires control, that to value something means to secure it. But this belief creates vulnerability. The more you attach your well-being to external things, the more exposed you become to their instability. Epictetus reverses this. He does not tell you to stop caring. He tells you to care correctly, to invest in what is yours and release what is not, to build your identity on your choices, not on their results. This is a form of strength that does not depend on circumstance. Now bring this into the modern condition. In 2025, the illusion of control has become more sophisticated. You are told that you can design your life, optimize your outcomes, control your future. This language is seductive because it expands your sense of agency, but it hides a critical truth. You can influence, but you cannot guarantee. This gap between influence and control is where anxiety grows. You do everything right, yet outcomes still vary. You plan carefully, yet uncertainty remains. You try to secure your position, yet external forces shift without warning. And instead of recognizing the limit, you blame yourself. You believe you failed to control what was never yours to control. This is the modern form of suffering. Not lack of effort, but misunderstanding of boundaries. Epictetus cuts through this illusion with precision. You are responsible for your choices, not for the entire chain of events that follows. You are responsible for your intention, not for the reaction of others. You are responsible for your discipline, not for the randomness of outcome. This distinction is not comforting. It removes the fantasy that life can be fully controlled. But it also removes unnecessary burden. Because once you stop claiming ownership over what is not yours, you stop blaming yourself for what you could never command. You stop exhausting yourself trying to stabilize the unstable. You begin to operate within reality instead of against it. This leads into the deeper psychological layer. Why do people resist this boundary so strongly? Because it reduces their perceived power. To accept that many things are not under your control feels like weakness. It feels like limitation. But this is a misunderstanding. False control creates false power, and false power collapses under pressure. Real power is smaller, but stable. It exists in your response, in your judgment, in your ability to remain aligned with reason, even when the external world shifts. This is not dramatic power. It is quiet. But it cannot be taken from you unless you abandon it. Now consider the internal consequence. When you stop demanding control over what is not yours, your mind becomes lighter. Not because life becomes easier, but because you stop fighting unnecessary battles. You conserve energy. You act where action matters. You release where action is futile. This is the beginning of peace. Not peace as comfort, but peace as alignment. You are no longer in constant conflict with reality. You are no longer surprised by change. You are no longer destabilized by what was always unstable. You begin to see life not as something to dominate, but as something to navigate with clarity. Through Epictetus, we see a human being who has accepted this fully, not as theory, but as practice. He does not claim control he does not have. He does not demand outcomes he cannot secure. He does not attach his dignity to what can be taken. And because of this, he becomes harder to break than those who appear more powerful. This is the paradox. The one who controls less externally becomes more stable internally. The one who accepts limits becomes less vulnerable to them. The one who releases false ownership gains real freedom. And now the final question emerges. If so much of what you cling to is not truly yours, why do you continue to build your life on it? Why do you measure yourself by outcomes you cannot guarantee? Why do you attach your peace to people you cannot control? Why do you define your identity through things that can disappear? There is no answer that can escape this, because the boundary is already real. You either see it and live within it, or ignore it and suffer against it. And the moment you stop claiming ownership over what was never yours, something changes. Not in the world, in your relationship to it. And that is where peace begins. Chapter 3, suffering does not begin in events, but in judgment. Pain enters life without asking permission. But suffering is not born at the same moment. Epictetus saw this with terrifying clarity. He understood that the event itself is only the first strike. The deeper wound is often made later, inside the mind, by the judgment that wraps itself around what happened. This is where the human being becomes not only the victim of circumstance, but the accomplice of inner torment. Before modern psychology gave names to cognitive distortion, emotional projection, and destructive interpretation, Epictetus had already identified the mechanism at the center of human misery. He did not deny pain. He did not pretend that loss, insult, illness, rejection, or death are light things. He said something harsher. The event arrives, then the mind speaks, and what the mind says next often becomes the real prison. This is the first blow to illusion. People believe they suffer because of what happened. They say the betrayal destroyed them, the failure broke them, the insult humiliated them, the loss made life unbearable. Epictetus tears through this surface explanation. He does not claim the event is irrelevant. He claims the event alone is not enough to explain the depth of suffering. Two people face the same loss. One is wounded but remains standing. The other collapses into bitterness, rage, or despair. Why? Because the event is shared, but the judgment is not. This is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. The world does not simply enter the mind. It is interpreted there. Every event arrives first as an impression, a raw contact between reality and consciousness. But the impression is not yet suffering. Suffering begins when the mind adds its verdict. This should not have happened. This means I am ruined. This proves I am worthless. This can never be survived. These are not facts. These are judgments. And once believed, they begin to choke the soul from within. Epictetus does not soften this truth because softness here would be betrayal. He knows the mind is not innocent. He knows it does not merely receive experience. It reshapes it, amplifies it, poisons it. An untrained mind is not a neutral witness. It is often an instrument of cruelty turned inward. It does not need an enemy because it has already learned how to become one. This is why his philosophy cuts deeper than comfort-based self-help. He is not telling you to think positively. He is telling you to stop lying to yourself about the source of your torment. The event is external. The judgment is internal. And until you distinguish them, you will keep blaming life for wounds your own interpretation continues to reopen. This distinction is severe because it destroys one of the most cherished illusions of the ego. The ego wants to believe it is purely acted upon. It wants to claim innocence in all pain. It wants to say the world did this to me and leave the analysis there. Epictetus refuses that luxury. He demands that the individual look at the second movement, the inner addition, the interpretation that transforms pain into prolonged suffering. This is not victim blaming. It is something more demanding. It is the restoration of agency. If suffering were created only by events, then the human being would be helpless. But if suffering is intensified by judgment, then the mind can be trained. And once the mind can be trained, freedom becomes possible again. The untrained mind does something fatal. It turns impressions into identities. A failure becomes proof of worthlessness. A rejection becomes proof of unlovability. A mistake becomes proof of inner corruption. A loss becomes proof that life is against us. This is how the mind builds a scaffold of suffering and then climbs onto it willingly. The event passes through the door. The judgment builds the house. Epictetus saw that the most dangerous thing about this process is how fast it happens. The mind does not pause, it reacts. It fuses what happened with what it means. And once this fusion occurs, the person no longer sees clearly. They are not responding to reality anymore. They are responding to the story their mind has constructed around reality. That story becomes heavier than the event itself. A person is insulted once, then repeats the insult internally 100 times. A person is rejected once, then keeps sentencing themselves through memory and interpretation for years. A person experiences failure in one area, then expands it into a total verdict on their existence. The event had an end. The judgment gave it a future. This is why Epictetus places such force on the distinction between what happens and what we say about what happens. It is not a technical distinction. It is the boundary between mental slavery and mental discipline. If you cannot separate the event from your interpretation, then every impression becomes a possible tyrant. The world strikes once. Your mind keeps striking. Now, the modern world makes this mechanism even more vicious. In 2025, the human being is not only exposed to events, they are exposed to constant comparison, endless narratives, social performances, and a culture that feeds interpretation at industrial speed. An ordinary setback is no longer just a setback. It becomes a mirror for identity. A silence in a message becomes rejection. A delay becomes disrespect. A professional failure becomes existential collapse. The event is small. The interpretation becomes monstrous. Modern life has not healed this ancient weakness. It has accelerated it. The mind has more material than ever with which to torture itself. It receives more impressions, more stimuli, more opportunities to misread, exaggerate, and personalize. And because the pace is so fast, few people pause long enough to examine what they are believing. Epictetus would look at this and say the same thing he said centuries ago. The problem is not only out there. The problem is in the untrained mind that obeys every impression as if it were truth. That obedience is the real bondage. Because the first impression often comes dressed as certainty. This is terrible. This is unbearable. This person has wronged me beyond repair. My future is ruined. I have been diminished. The foolish mind kneels immediately. The disciplined mind waits. And in that waiting, a door opens. Not a door into comfort, but into freedom. Epictetus understood that there is a sacred fraction of time between impression and assent. A moment small enough to miss, but large enough to save a life. In that moment, the mind can ask, is this true, or is this only how it appears right now? Is this event itself unbearable, or is my judgment making it unbearable? Is this pain real, or is the added story what is crushing me? Most people never enter that moment consciously. They are swept away before reflection begins. They do not question the interpretation because the interpretation feels identical to reality. This is the deepest danger. The mind does not announce that it is distorting. It speaks in the voice of certainty, and yet Epictetus insists, Certainty is often the first mask of error. This is where existential psychology becomes ruthless. Human beings do not merely suffer from external wounds. They suffer from the need to make those wounds mean something total. The mind cannot tolerate raw pain, so it turns pain into narrative. It transforms an event into a conclusion about the self, the world, and the future. This is why people cling to suffering, not because suffering is pleasant, but because the narrative gives the pain a structure. It feels more bearable to believe life is against me than to face the more terrifying truth that pain can occur without cosmic explanation. This is a hard truth. The event may simply be what it is: a loss, a failure, a sickness, a humiliation, nothing more. But the human being wants more, wants meaning, wants a verdict, wants a total story. And that hunger for meaning often creates unnecessary suffering. Epictetus strips away this appetite for dramatic interpretation. He says, the event happened. Now watch what your mind is doing. Watch how it reaches, labels, expands, condemns. Watch how it turns a moment into a prison sentence. This watching is not passive. It is the beginning of sovereignty. Because once you can observe the judgment, you are no longer identical with it. That is the fracture through which freedom enters. You still feel pain. Stoicism is not numbness. You still tremble, grieve, react. But you no longer accept every inner statement as law. You begin to see that the mind produces claims, not truths. It offers interpretations, not revelations. And once this becomes clear, suffering starts to lose its total authority. Through Epictetus, we see a human being who refuses to hand final power to the first interpretation. He does not deny emotion. He interrogates it. He does not trust the immediate verdict of the mind. He examines it. He knows that the first response is often not wisdom, but habit, not truth, but conditioning, not clarity, but fear speaking quickly. This changes everything, because now the task of life is not to eliminate difficult events. That is impossible. The task is to stop becoming the instrument of your own inner violence. The task is to catch the judgment before it hardens into identity. The task is to train the mind to endure reality without automatically turning reality into self-destruction. And here, the final question arrives, like a blade. How much of your suffering is caused by life? And how much is caused by what you keep telling yourself about life? That question cannot be answered lazily. It demands honesty sharp enough to cut through self-pity, drama, and the ego's addiction to innocence. It demands that you look inward and see the machinery of interpretation for what it is. Not fate, not truth, a habit of mind. And habits can be broken. That is why Epictetus still matters. He does not promise a painless life. He gives something harder. He gives the possibility that your mind does not have to remain the place where pain becomes torture. He reminds you that events will come as they come, but judgment is the place where slavery either deepens or ends. And in the moment you stop worshiping your first interpretation, suffering loses its throne. Chapter 4. The art of using impressions. Freedom is often lost before action even begins. It is lost in the instant the mind believes the first thing it sees, feels, or fears. Epictetus understood this with merciless precision. He knew that human beings are not destroyed only by events, nor even by judgments alone, but by the speed with which they surrender to what appears before them. An impression arrives, and the untrained mind kneels. That is where slavery begins. Before modern psychology tried to map automatic thoughts, emotional triggers, and cognitive response, Epictetus had already identified the battlefield. He saw that every human life is flooded by impressions, images, impulses, fears, desires, humiliations, hopes, pleasures, and threats all strike the mind without warning. None of this can be prevented completely. The problem is not that impressions come. The problem is that most people treat them as truth the moment they arrive. This is the first fracture. An impression is not reality in its final form. It is only the first appearance of reality to the mind. It says something is terrible, irresistible, humiliating, urgent, necessary, pleasurable, unbearable. But it says it immediately. And immediacy is precisely why it is dangerous. What comes first often comes with force, not with accuracy. The untrained soul confuses force with truth. Epictetus refuses this confusion. He teaches that the mind must not react like a servant dragged by every inner movement. It must pause. It must examine. It must ask what exactly is being presented here and whether it deserves belief. This is not a minor adjustment in temperament. It is the beginning of self-rule. Because the person who cannot question an impression is already governed by it. This is why the art of using impressions stands at the center of inner freedom. Most people think freedom means choosing big things: career, relationship, lifestyle, direction. But Epictetus cuts deeper. He knows freedom is usually lost in the smallest and fastest moment, the instant before assent. Something happens. A word is spoken. A face changes. A message goes unanswered. A desire rises. Anger flares. Fear appears. And then the mind says, "This is unbearable. This is an insult. This proves something. This demands reaction now." That is the moment that matters. Not later. Not after the damage. There. The wise person does not become wise by having no impressions. That is impossible. The wise person becomes wise by not granting immediate authority to what first appears. This is a severe discipline because impressions rarely present themselves modestly. They arrive dressed as certainty. Anger does not say, "Perhaps you have been wronged." It says, "You have been wronged." Fear does not whisper, "There may be danger." It declares, "Danger is here." Desire does not suggest, "This might be pleasant." It insists, "You need this now." And because these impressions feel alive, urgent, and intimate, most people believe them before they examine them. This is how the soul is captured. Not by change from the outside, but by uninspected assent from within. Epictetus saw that the mind possesses a power so small it is often missed, yet so decisive it determines the quality of an entire life. The power to withhold agreement. The power to say, wait. The power to let an impression stand at the door without immediately inviting it to rule the house. This is not denial of emotion. It is refusal of automatic obedience. That refusal is the birthplace of dignity. A person who reacts instantly believes they are being authentic. In truth, they are often being mechanical. They imagine they are expressing themselves, but they are merely transmitting the first force that passed through them. There is nothing noble in this. An unexamined reaction is not freedom. It is reflex, decorated as identity. Epictetus tears away that decoration. He shows that between impression and response lies the narrow territory in which character is formed. If you lose that territory, you lose yourself. If you keep it, even briefly, you begin to live by reason rather than compulsion. This is why the Stoic discipline is not coldness. It is vigilance, a fierce interior watchfulness against being ruled by what arrives first. Now bring this into the modern world. In 2025, impressions attack with a violence previous ages could not have imagined. Alerts, headlines, feeds, messages, images, opinions, praise, outrage, seduction, comparison, humiliation. All of it arrives faster than reflection. The modern mind is not merely distracted, it is invaded. It lives in a state of almost continuous impression, and because of that, it increasingly loses the habit of pause. This makes Epictetus more relevant, not less. The person who cannot stop before believing is now easier to control than ever, not only by rulers or institutions, but by platforms, narratives, emotional contagion, and the market of attention itself. A manipulated mind is not always a mind forced from outside. Often it is a mind trained to assent too quickly. Every impression comes with an invitation. Believe this, fear this, desire this, hate this, define yourself by this, react now. The unfree person accepts the invitation before recognizing that it was an invitation. The disciplined person notices the seduction. That notice is everything. Because once an impression is seen as an appearance rather than a command, its power begins to weaken. This is where inner observation becomes essential. Epictetus does not ask the individual merely to think better after the fact. He asks them to watch the movement of the mind as it happens, to see anger rising and not merge with it, to feel desire and not instantly call it destiny, to encounter fear and not immediately pronounce disaster. This requires a form of psychological sharpness that most people never train. And because they never train it, they remain internally vulnerable. A person may appear strong in public and still be weak before impressions. They may hold status, education, confidence, influence, and still be unable to resist an inner surge of envy, resentment, panic, or craving. Epictetus is not impressed by external composure. He asks a harder question. When the impression strikes, who rules? This question exposes the truth. Because most people are not overthrown by great catastrophes. They are overthrown daily by minor, unexamined impressions. A look from another person, a slight delay, a failed expectation, a memory that resurfaces, a fantasy that seduces, a fear that speaks too loudly. The soul leaks freedom through these tiny openings, then wonders why it feels exhausted, reactive, and unstable. Epictetus would say the answer is clear. You are granting assent carelessly. This does not mean life becomes easy once you begin resisting false impressions. It becomes more conscious. And consciousness is harder than sleep. To pause when anger wants motion is hard. To examine fear when fear demands surrender is hard. To interrogate desire when desire promises pleasure is hard. But difficulty is not an argument against truth. It is often evidence that truth is finally being practiced. Here the deeper existential layer appears. Human beings do not merely suffer impressions. They often want to believe them. Why? Because impressions simplify reality. They offer instant certainty in a world that is often ambiguous. Anger tells you who the enemy is. Fear tells you what to avoid. Desire tells you what will save you. Shame tells you who you are. These messages are brutal, but they are clear. And the mind, terrified of uncertainty, often prefers a false clarity to a patient examination. This is why the art of using impressions is not only psychological, it is moral. It asks whether you are willing to endure uncertainty long enough for reason to speak. That is the real test, not whether you feel the impression, but whether you are strong enough not to crown it too early. A weak soul wants immediate verdicts. A disciplined soul can remain in suspension for a moment longer. That moment changes everything. In that moment, anger may be seen as wounded pride. Fear may be seen as projection. Desire may be seen as dependency. Shame may be seen as a judgment, not a fact. The impression has not disappeared, but it has been stripped of its throne. This is how freedom actually functions in Epictetus, not as grand rebellion, not as external permission, but as the capacity to keep the ruling center of the self from being occupied by every passing appearance. The soul becomes less like an open city and more like a guarded one, not closed, not numb, but ordered. Through this discipline, a new type of human being emerges, not one without emotion, but one who does not confuse emotion with command, not one without desire, but one who does not worship desire, not one without fear, but one who does not obey fear automatically. This is not repression. Repression buries. Epictetus does not bury impressions. He exposes them to examination. He insists they stand trial before reason. Some are valid. Many are exaggerated. Some warn wisely. Many distort. The point is not to silence the inner life. The point is to stop letting the first voice become the final authority. This is where self-observation becomes sacred. A person who can see their impressions clearly is already less enslaved by them. Awareness creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice creates character. And character, for Epictetus, is not inherited. It is built in these microscopic moments of assent or refusal. That is why training matters. No one becomes stable by admiring this idea. One becomes stable by practicing it again and again until the pause becomes real, until the mind no longer lunges at every appearance, until the soul learns that not everything it feels deserves belief. This training is severe because life keeps testing it. The same anger returns, the same fear returns, the same old insecurity returns, wearing a new mask. But repetition is not failure. Repetition is the workshop of mastery. Each impression is another chance to reclaim the ruling center from chaos. And now the final question cuts through everything. When the next impression arrives, as anger, panic, desire, envy, hurt, or humiliation, will you believe it immediately? Or will you stop long enough to see what is trying to rule you? That is the real dividing line. Not between smart and foolish, not between educated and ignorant, but between those who live under inner tyranny and those who begin to govern themselves. Epictetus leaves no room for self-deception here. You are always being invited to surrender your freedom in exchange for the speed of reaction. The impression arrives, demanding assent. The world inside you leans forward, and there, in that tiny invisible instant, your whole life takes shape. Because the person who can pause is no longer owned. And that is where mastery begins. Chapter 5. We suffer because we cling to what cannot last. Human misery often begins with a silent transfer of power. We hand our peace to things that were never built to hold it. Epictetus saw this with brutal precision. He understood that people do not only suffer because life is harsh. They suffer because they attach themselves to what is unstable, then act shocked when it collapses. This is not merely emotional weakness. It is a philosophical error at the center of ordinary life. Before the modern world turned desire into identity and consumption into a substitute for meaning, Epictetus had already exposed the mechanism beneath both. He saw that the human being is always reaching outward, fastening happiness to possessions, status, approval, romance, health, success, and all the fragile objects of external life. These things are not evil. That is not his point. His point is harder. The moment you treat them as the foundation of your inner stability, you make yourself structurally vulnerable to loss. This is where suffering deepens. Money can disappear, reputation can rot overnight, bodies decay, lovers leave, friends change, positions fall. The world does not promise permanence, yet the human mind keeps demanding it. It says, this must stay, this must remain mine, this must not change, this must continue to affirm me. And when reality does what reality always does, when it shifts, withdraws, breaks, or dies, the self collapses with it. Epictetus does not call this fate alone. He calls it attachment. This is the first cut. Most people do not lose themselves when external things change because those things are inherently unbearable to lose. They lose themselves because they built themselves into those things in the first place. They tied their identity to what was temporary, then called the resulting dependence love, ambition, security, or success. Epictetus strips away that sentimental language. He forces a more merciless question. Why did you place your center in what you could never keep? This question exposes almost everything. You say you only wanted love, but often what you wanted was emotional insurance. You say you only wanted success, but often what you wanted was proof of worth. You say you only wanted comfort, but often what you wanted was protection from the instability of existence. External things become dangerous, not because they exist, but because the mind secretly asks them to do what they cannot do. It asks them to guarantee the self. They cannot. And that is why attachment becomes suffering. Epictetus understood desire as a movement of the soul toward what it believes will complete it. That movement is not innocent. When directed toward unstable things, it becomes a trap. Because the more you need what is outside you to remain as it is, the more you surrender your peace to forces that do not obey you. Attachment is not love. It is dependency hidden inside love. It is not appreciation. It is psychological investment in what can be taken. This is why the soul becomes fragile. A fragile soul is not one that feels deeply. It is one that places its foundation in what it cannot command. It rises when external life rises. It falls when external life falls. It has no center of gravity within itself. It is dragged by gain and loss, praise and blame, presence and absence, pleasure and deprivation. Epictetus looks at such a soul and sees not tragedy, but misplacement. The cure is not numbness. This must be said clearly. Epictetus is not telling human beings to become stone. He is not asking them to reject relationships, effort, beauty, or affection. He is asking something far more disciplined. Enjoy what is given without confusing it for your essence. Participate fully without kneeling inwardly. Care without chaining your identity to the outcome. This is much harder than emotional excess because excess feels sincere. Discipline feels severe. But discipline is what preserves dignity. A person attached to externals does not merely want things. They become morally distorted by wanting them too much. They flatter when dignity should stand. They panic when patience is needed. They envy when reflection is required. They betray themselves to keep hold of what was never secure. This is the hidden degradation of attachment. It does not only make you suffer when you lose, it weakens your character while you are still trying to keep. Epictetus reverses the axis of value. He says the true center of life must move from possession to virtue, not from having to being, not from securing externals to governing the self. This is a violent reordering of modern instinct, because modern instinct says, build a life by accumulating enough around you that you feel untouchable. Epictetus says, that is precisely how you become touchable. The more pieces of yourself you scatter into external things, the more ways life has to wound you. Now the modern world makes this even worse. In 2025, attachment is no longer accidental. It is cultivated. Entire systems train the human being to live outwardly, to measure worth by visibility, value by productivity, identity by desirability, emotional security by constant affirmation. People are encouraged to brand themselves, market themselves, compare themselves, optimize themselves, and seek completion through external markers that are unstable by nature. This does not reduce suffering. It industrializes it. Because now, When the external world trembles, the self has no refuge. A career setback feels like personal annihilation. A broken relationship becomes evidence of inner emptiness. Financial instability becomes metaphysical panic. Aging becomes humiliation. Silence becomes rejection. The event is one thing. The collapse of identity beneath it is another. Epictetus saw the root of this long ago. We suffer disproportionately because we have confused what we have with what we are. That confusion is lethal to peace. Look closely at attachment, and you will find fear beneath it. Fear of not being enough without the object. Fear of insignificance without recognition. Fear of loneliness without the beloved. Fear of meaninglessness without achievement. Fear of emptiness without possession. Attachment is rarely just affection. It is often a contract the soul makes with externals. Stay, and I will feel whole. Leave, and I will shatter. But externals never sign that contract. That is why the pain feels so personal when they move. The deeper psychological truth is harsher. Human beings often cling because they do not know how to stand inwardly without support. They have never built a stable relation to themselves. So they borrow structure from the outside. Another person becomes their emotional spine. Success becomes their self-esteem. Wealth becomes their sense of safety. Public admiration becomes their mirror. This can function for years. Then one change arrives and the whole hidden architecture collapses. Epictetus calls us back to inner architecture. He demands that the self become capable of existing without constant external reinforcement. Not because externals do not matter at all, but because they cannot be trusted with your deepest center. If your peace depends on them, then your peace is leased, not owned. And anything leased can be taken back. This is why he shifts emphasis from possession to character. Virtue cannot stop loss, but it can prevent loss from destroying you. Wisdom cannot guarantee success, but it can keep failure from becoming self-hatred. Self-command cannot preserve every relationship, but it can prevent abandonment from turning into total collapse. The external wound may still arrive, but the internal structure remains standing. That is the real strength Epictetus offers. Not immunity from pain, but freedom from disintegration. And yet most people resist this because attachment feels human. It feels warm, immediate, alive. To loosen attachment seems cruel, as if one is betraying love or ambition or devotion. But Epictetus would answer that clinging is not the highest form of love. It is fear gripping what it cannot secure. Real love does not attempt to possess the other as a defense against mortality. Real engagement with life does not demand guarantees before it dares to care. This distinction matters, because once you see it, you understand that attachment is not depth. Often it is panic. It is the soul saying, I do not know how to remain whole if this changes. Epictetus wants to build a soul that can remain whole. Not indifferent, not cold, but whole. Capable of loving without captivity. Acting without addiction to results. Enjoying without becoming enslaved by enjoyment. This requires mourning an illusion. The illusion that anything external can make you permanently secure. It cannot. The beloved can die. The body can fail, fortune can reverse, institutions can collapse, youth can vanish, praise can rot into blame. Every external thing comes stamped with impermanence, yet the mind still says mine, as if the word could defeat time. Epictetus tears that word out of the mouth of the eagle, not to produce despair, but to produce lucidity. Once lucidity appears, a different way of living becomes possible. You still hold what is given, but more lightly. You still work, but without worshipping the reward. You still love, but without turning the other person into the container of your selfhood. You still enjoy beauty, comfort, and success, but you do not kneel before them. You remember what they are: temporary visitors, not foundations. This remembrance does not empty life. It purifies it. It removes greed from love, panic from ambition, and terror from change. It allows the human being to participate in the world without asking the world to do the work of inner stability. And that is the beginning of real freedom. Not withdrawal from life, but release from the need to extract permanence from what is passing. Through Epictetus, we see that suffering grows in direct proportion to misplaced investment. The more you deposit your identity in unstable things, the more violently you will shake when they move. The more you root yourself in character, the less each external loss can become a total verdict on your existence. This is not abstract morality. It is existential engineering. So the final question lands without mercy. What have you handed your happiness to? What have you secretly asked to save you? What external thing have you elevated into a condition for your inner peace? Because whatever that is, it already owns more of you than you admit. And until that ownership is broken, you will remain hostage to the fragile. Epictetus does not promise that life will stop taking. He offers something more demanding. He teaches the soul how not to be taken along with what it loses. And that is the moment suffering begins to lose its right to define you. Chapter 6. The first discipline is the discipline of desire. Desire is where the soul first betrays itself. Long before a person is ruined by fate, loss, or conflict, they are usually ruined by wanting the wrong thing in the wrong way. Epictetus saw this with merciless clarity. He understood that anxiety does not begin when the world refuses us. It begins earlier, in the moment we demand that the world obey us. That is why the first discipline is not action. It is not speech. It is not even endurance. It is desire. Before the modern world turned wanting into a virtue and appetite into an identity, Epictetus had already exposed the deepest source of unrest. He saw that human beings do not only suffer because life is unstable. They suffer because their desires are aimed at what is unstable. They want outcomes, control, praise, security, permanence, possession, and emotional guarantees from a world that has never promised any of these things. Then they act surprised when the result is fear. This is the first fracture. Most people think desire is harmless unless it becomes extreme. Epictetus goes deeper. He knows the problem is not intensity alone. The problem is direction. A person can desire moderately and still be enslaved if the object of desire lies outside reason and outside control. A person can want softly and still suffer deeply if what they want is not truly theirs to secure. This is why he places desire at the beginning of discipline. Because desire determines vulnerability. Whatever you crave beyond reason becomes a place where life can threaten you. Whatever you cannot bear not to have becomes a chain around your judgment. Whatever you insist must happen becomes a silent confession that your peace depends on what does not belong to you. That is not freedom. That is elegant servitude. Epictetus does not tell the human being to stop wanting altogether. That would be too simple and too false. He demands something harder. Want only what accords with reason. Desire only what can remain good even when the world changes. Aim the soul toward virtue, clarity, self-command, and right judgment, because these alone are not hostage to external events. Everything else may be enjoyed, pursued, and appreciated, but not worshipped. This distinction changes everything, because the undisciplined person does not merely want success, they need it to feel real. They do not merely prefer approval, they depend on it to remain internally stable. They do not merely seek comfort, they panic when comfort is interrupted. Desire becomes corrupted when preference hardens into necessity. That hardening is the birthplace of anxiety. The moment the mind says, "I must have this," fear enters. Because now, loss becomes intolerable. Delay becomes an offense. Uncertainty becomes torment. The soul is no longer moving freely toward a goal. It is kneeling before an external condition and calling that kneeling passion, ambition, romance, or hope. Epictetus strips away these beautiful disguises. He asks a harsher question. Why are you giving external things the authority to decide whether your inner life remains standing? This is where modern people are especially exposed. In 2025, desire is not merely present. It is cultivated, sharpened, monetized, and endlessly stimulated. You are told to want more, become more, acquire more, optimize more, display more. Every system around you profits from an undisciplined appetite. A peaceful soul buys little. A restless soul consumes endlessly. So the modern person is taught to confuse desire with vitality and dissatisfaction with growth. But this does not create freedom. It creates permanent agitation. Because the more the soul is trained to desire what lies outside it, the more fragile it becomes. Achievement does not calm it, it inflames it. Possession does not complete it, it expands the range of what can now be lost. Recognition does not settle it, it makes silence more unbearable. Undisciplined desire does not end in satisfaction, it reproduces hunger. Epictetus saw this long before the machinery of modern life turned it into a culture. He knew that misplaced desire is the root of disturbance because it makes the soul hostile to reality. The world is never enough because it never perfectly obeys. Events arrive in the wrong order. People fail to behave as we hoped. Time removes what we tried to keep. Illness interrupts plans. Death tears through attachment. And the undisciplined soul responds with resentment, as if reality itself has committed an insult. But reality has done nothing personal. It has only refused to become your servant. This is the second fracture. Human beings often imagine that suffering begins when reality becomes harsh. Epictetus shows that suffering often begins when desire becomes irrational. When you want what no human being can safely demand, you construct your own vulnerability. You convert life into a field of disappointment because you keep asking it for guarantees it cannot give. That is why the first discipline must be the discipline of desire. Not because desire is evil, but because desire is directional power. It points the whole soul somewhere. If it points toward externals, the soul becomes unstable. If it points toward virtue, the soul begins to stand on ground that does not shift with every wind. This sounds severe, because it is severe. To desire rightly means to reduce the ego's demands. It means to stop asking the world to confirm your importance. It means to stop treating comfort as a right. It means to stop confusing what is pleasant with what is good. It means to accept that many of your strongest wants are not evidence of truth, but evidence of conditioning. This is why the discipline hurts. It is not only a correction of behavior, it is a humiliation of false sovereignty. The ego wants to believe that whatever it wants must matter. Epictetus answers with a blade. No, wanting does not sanctify the object. Appetite does not create entitlement. Intensity does not make a desire wise. This is where the interior battle begins. A person starts to notice how many desires enter unexamined. The wish to be admired, the need to win, the urge to be comforted immediately, the hunger to be chosen by a certain person, the demand that life unfold according to private fantasy. These impulses feel personal, intimate, alive. But Epictetus forces them into judgment. Are they rational? Are they worthy? Do they strengthen the soul or expose it? Most people never ask these questions. They obey desire and then try to manage the consequences. They call this living naturally. Epictetus would call it living lazily. Because a human being is not noble simply because they feel strongly. A human being becomes noble when they learn which inner movements deserve consent and which deserve refusal. Now the deeper psychological truth appears. Undisciplined desire often hides fear. The desire for wealth may hide fear of worthlessness. The desire for constant love may hide fear of inner emptiness. The desire for control may hide fear of uncertainty. The desire for status may hide fear of being unseen. So when Epictetus disciplines desire, he is not merely reducing appetite. He is exposing the insecurity underneath it. This exposure is hard to endure because it reveals that many desires are not free choices at all. They are emotional dependencies dressed as goals. The soul reaches outward because it does not know how to stand inwardly. It wants the world to quiet what it has not learned to govern within itself. That is why discipline becomes liberation. Not because you get less, but because less owns you. A person who desires irrationally is easy to manipulate. Offer them praise and they bend. Threaten their comfort and they panic. Place a reward in front of them and their judgment weakens. Promise them status and they betray themselves. But a person whose desire has been trained becomes difficult to corrupt. They may still feel attraction toward externals, but they do not sell their center for them. This is real strength, not numbness, not emptiness, not passivity. Strength. The strength to say, I prefer this, but I do not need it to remain myself. The strength to say, I will work for this, but I will not let its absence turn me into bitterness. The strength to say, I can love, without demanding permanence from what is mortal. This is the kind of human being Epictetus is trying to form. Someone who does not ask the world to remove all frustration, but learns to desire in a way that frustration cannot destroy. Someone whose peace is not built on satisfaction of appetite, but on alignment with reason. Someone who sees that the first battlefield of freedom is not out there in institutions, conflict, or adversity, but inside the movement of wanting. And because this battlefield is inside, it must be trained repeatedly. No single insight is enough. A person may understand the principle in the morning and be betrayed by noon. Desire returns constantly, wearing new masks. Today it is ambition. Tomorrow it is romance. The next day it is resentment disguised as justice. The soul must keep asking the same ruthless question. Is this desire making me more rational or more dependent? That question is the beginning of purification. Through it, the person learns to distinguish preference from enslavement. They can enjoy what is pleasant without kneeling before it. They can work for success without becoming owned by outcome. They can enter relationships without turning the other into a psychological crutch. They can endure disappointment without treating disappointment as a cosmic insult. This is not a smaller life. It is a cleaner one. A life in which desire no longer drags the soul into humiliation. A life in which peace is not destroyed every time reality declines to cooperate. A life in which the self is not scattered across 1,000 cravings that all demand immediate obedience. Through Epictetus, we see that the discipline of desire is the first discipline because every later discipline depends on it. If desire remains chaotic, judgment will bend, action will weaken, and peace will dissolve. But if desire is brought under reason, the whole inner life begins to reorder itself. The person becomes less theatrical, less desperate, less vulnerable to the world's changing surface. And now the question comes without mercy. What are you demanding from life that life never promised to give? What are you calling necessary that is only preferred? What desire has already taken so much authority over you that its frustration feels like the end of yourself? Until these questions are faced, the soul remains divided against reality. But the moment desire is disciplined, something shifts. The world does not become softer. The self becomes harder to enslave. And that is where the first real peace begins. Chapter 7. Live according to the role you are given. A human being does not exist alone, no matter how much they pretend. Identity is not a private invention. It is a structure formed through relationships, obligations, and roles that cannot be escaped without distortion. Epictetus understood this with a clarity that dismantles modern illusions of absolute individuality. You are not only yourself. You are also a son, a daughter, a parent, a friend, a citizen. And the moment you deny this, you do not become free. You become fragmented. Before the modern world elevated personal desire above all else, before it told individuals that authenticity means doing whatever aligns with inner feeling, Epictetus had already placed a boundary. Freedom does not erase responsibility. It intensifies it. Because once you understand yourself as a rational being, you must also understand yourself as part of a larger order of human connection. This is where the first fracture appears. People believe that living well means protecting the self from external demands. They think responsibility limits freedom. They see roles as constraints imposed by society, tradition, or expectation. But Epictetus reverses this entirely. He does not see roles as prisons. He sees them as fields of expression. You do not lose yourself by fulfilling your role correctly. You reveal who you are, but only if you understand what that role demands. To be a parent is not simply to feel affection. It is to act with care, patience, and responsibility, even when affection is difficult. To be a friend is not only to share comfort, but to stand with integrity, loyalty, and honesty, even when it costs you. To be a citizen is not merely to exist within a system, but to engage with justice, responsibility, and the consequences of collective life. These are not optional layers of identity. They are structural. And when they are ignored, something inside the individual begins to decay. Epictetus does not allow the excuse of personal preference to override this. He does not ask what you feel like doing in your role. He asks what your role requires. This is a harsh question because it removes comfort. It removes spontaneity as the ultimate guide. It replaces it with duty grounded in reason. This is where modern thinking resists, because modern culture often teaches that the highest value is personal fulfillment, that the individual must prioritize their own emotional satisfaction above all else, that relationships are valid only as long as they align with internal desire. Epictetus would see this as instability disguised as freedom, because a person who abandons their role whenever it becomes difficult is not free. They are ruled by fluctuation. True freedom requires consistency, not blind obedience, but rational commitment to what one stands within. This does not mean rigidly following tradition without thought. Epictetus is not advocating for passive conformity. He is demanding conscious participation. To know your role, to understand its structure, and to fulfill it with awareness. This is not submission, it is alignment. Now the second movement sharpens. The human being often tries to isolate self-mastery from social life. They believe that controlling their thoughts, desires, and reactions is enough. But Epictetus sees that self-mastery must extend into how you relate to others. Because your character is not only tested in isolation, it is revealed in interaction. Anyone can appear calm alone. Anyone can appear rational without pressure. But in the presence of others, conflict emerges. Expectations collide. Emotions rise. Responsibilities weigh. This is where philosophy becomes real. Not in theory, but in behavior. Epictetus demands that you carry your inner discipline into your roles, not to perform goodness, but to embody it. If you claim to value reason, then your actions within relationships must reflect that. If you claim to value integrity, then your role as a friend, partner, or citizen must show it. Otherwise, your philosophy is decorative. This is where many fail. They think correctly, but live incorrectly. They understand principles, but abandon them in action. They speak of virtue, but choose convenience. Epictetus does not separate thinking from living. He sees them as one. A person who fails in their role is not lacking knowledge, they are lacking application. Now bring this into the modern world. In 2025, identity has become fluid, customizable, and often detached from responsibility. People define themselves by preference, interest, and personal narrative. Roles become secondary, optional, negotiable. This creates a sense of freedom on the surface, but instability beneath it. Because without stable roles, the individual lacks grounding. They drift between identities. They shift according to mood. They struggle to maintain consistent behavior. They seek validation rather than responsibility. This is not liberation, it is fragmentation. Epictetus offers a counter movement. He says you do not invent yourself from nothing. You are placed into a network of relations, and within that network, you must act. The question is not whether you have a role. The question is whether you will fulfill it well or abandon it poorly. This is where the deeper psychological layer appears. Why do people resist their roles? Because roles impose limits. They demand effort, even when desire fades. They require consistency, even when emotion fluctuates. They force the individual to consider others, not only themselves. This creates tension between desire and duty. Most people resolve this tension by choosing desire. Epictetus resolves it differently. He aligns duty with reason. He shows that living according to role is not suppression of the self, but expression of a rational self that understands its place in a larger structure. This understanding does not remove individuality, it refines it, because individuality without structure becomes chaos, but individuality within structure becomes character. This is where dignity emerges, not from doing whatever one feels, but from doing what is right within the context one inhabits, not from escaping responsibility, but from carrying it without collapse, not from avoiding difficulty, but from meeting it with consistency. Through Epictetus, we see that the human being is both independent and connected, independent in judgment, connected in role. To neglect either is to distort life. Too much independence without connection leads to isolation and instability. Too much connection without independence leads to submission and loss of self. The balance is severe. Think clearly, act responsibly, hold your inner freedom, fulfill your outer roles, and do not confuse one for the other. This is the discipline of social existence. Now the final question cuts through everything. Are you living according to your role or escaping it when it becomes uncomfortable? Are you using freedom as a justification for inconsistency? Are you choosing desire over responsibility, then calling it authenticity? There is no way to avoid this, because every day, in every interaction, your role is present. You are always something to someone, and how you respond to that fact defines you more than what you claim to believe. Epictetus leaves no space for illusion here. You cannot be virtuous in thought and careless in role. You cannot claim self-mastery while failing those who depend on your integrity. You cannot separate who you are from how you act within the structures of human life. And once this is understood, something becomes clear. Freedom is not the absence of obligation. It is the ability to meet obligation without losing yourself. And that is where true character is formed. Chapter 8. To live according to nature is to accept without surrender. Human beings do not suffer only because life is difficult. They suffer because they fight the structure of reality itself. Epictetus saw this with a clarity that leaves no space for illusion. He understood that peace does not come from controlling what happens, but from aligning oneself with what must happen. Not as resignation, not as weakness, but as a disciplined agreement with the nature of existence. Before modern thought reduced nature to environment or biology, before people began to interpret life as something to be reshaped endlessly according to preference, Epictetus spoke of something far more severe. Nature is not merely the world outside, it is the order of things, the structure of cause and effect, the limits placed on human control, the reality that unfolds whether you approve of it or not. This is where the first fracture appears. People believe that to live well means to bend life toward their desires. They think fulfillment comes from shaping reality to match expectation. But reality does not negotiate. Events occur. Time moves. Loss arrives. Change is constant. And when the human being refuses to accept this, they enter into permanent conflict with the world. This conflict is exhausting because it cannot be won. Epictetus does not ask the individual to stop acting. He asks them to stop resisting what has already happened. This is the distinction most people fail to understand. Acceptance is not passivity. It is clarity about what cannot be reversed. When something has occurred, it belongs to the past. To reject it emotionally is to fight something that no longer exists as a possibility. This is where suffering multiplies. Not in the event itself, but in the refusal to let the event stand as it is. The mind says, this should not have happened. This is wrong. This must be undone. But reality remains unchanged. And so the mind enters a loop of resistance against what cannot be altered. This is not strength. It is self-inflicted tension. Epictetus cuts through this illusion. He teaches that to live according to nature is to accept what has occurred as part of the structure of reality. Not because it is pleasant, not because it is fair, but because it is real. And reality does not require your approval to exist. This is a brutal shift because it removes the fantasy that life owes you a certain outcome. It removes the belief that your expectations have authority over events. It forces you to see that the world is not arranged around your preferences. And once this is seen, the struggle changes direction. You no longer fight what has happened. You focus on how to respond to it. This is where the second movement begins. Acceptance does not mean inaction. Epictetus is clear about this. To accept reality is not to abandon responsibility. It is to act within the conditions that exist rather than against them. You do not deny the situation. You engage with it. But you do so without the illusion that it should be different. This creates a form of strength that most people never develop, because most people act from resistance, not from clarity. They try to fix what has already occurred. They try to control what lies beyond their reach. They waste energy fighting the structure of reality instead of working within it. Epictetus reverses this. He says, accept the given, then act where action is possible. This alignment removes unnecessary suffering because you stop demanding that the world change before you can function. You stop waiting for perfect conditions before you act. You stop tying your emotional state to whether reality matches your preference. Instead, you operate within what is. This is what it means to live according to nature, not to retreat from life, but to stop opposing its fundamental structure. Now the modern world intensifies this conflict in a new way. In 2025, people are taught that everything can be optimized, improved, controlled, that with enough effort, enough intelligence, enough strategy, life can be shaped into a predictable system. This belief creates a dangerous expectation that anything that goes wrong is either a failure of effort or an injustice. But reality does not follow this logic. Even with maximum effort, uncertainty remains. Even with perfect planning, disruption occurs. Even with intelligence, outcomes cannot be guaranteed. And when this becomes clear, frustration turns into anger. Anger turns into exhaustion. Exhaustion turns into quiet despair. Not because life is uniquely cruel, but because the expectation of control was unrealistic from the beginning. Epictetus dismantles this expectation. He shows that peace does not come from eliminating uncertainty, but from accepting it as a permanent condition. This acceptance is not defeat. It is the removal of a false demand. You no longer ask life to be predictable. You prepare yourself to face unpredictability. This is a different form of strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of adaptation. Now the deeper psychological layer appears. Why is acceptance so difficult? Because the ego wants to feel central. It wants to believe that its desires matter in a way that reality must respect. It wants to feel that its expectations have weight. To accept reality without resistance feels like a loss of importance. It feels like surrender. But this is a misunderstanding. What is lost is not importance. It is illusion. Epictetus does not reduce the value of the individual. He removes the belief that the individual stands above the structure of the world. And in doing so, he creates a new form of dignity, the dignity of alignment. A person who lives according to nature does not break when reality shifts. They adjust. They respond. They remain intact because they are not fighting what cannot be changed. This does not make them passive. It makes them effective. Because all their energy is directed toward what can actually be influenced. This is where responsibility returns. Once you accept what is, you cannot hide behind resistance anymore. You cannot say things would be better if only reality were different. Reality is what it is. Now, what will you do within it? This is the real question. And it is far more demanding than complaint, because it removes excuses. It places action back in your hands, but only within the limits that exist. Through Epictetus, we see a human being who does not waste energy opposing the inevitable. He does not argue with time. He does not demand permanence. He does not reject change. He accepts the structure of existence, and within that structure, he acts with clarity. This is not a smaller life. It is a more precise one. A life where suffering is not amplified by resistance. A life where action is not weakened by denial. a life where the self is not constantly in conflict with reality. And now the final question emerges. What are you still refusing to accept? What part of reality are you still fighting as if it could be undone? What event are you still resisting long after it has already become fact? Because that resistance is not changing the world. It is only exhausting you. And the moment you stop demanding that reality conform to your will, something shifts. Not outside, inside. The conflict dissolves. The energy returns. The mind becomes clear. And from that clarity, action becomes possible again. That is where peace begins. Not when life becomes easy, but when you stop trying to force it to be something it is not. Chapter 9. Train the mind like you train the body. Understanding truth once does not change a life. Epictetus saw this with ruthless clarity. Insight without repetition dissolves. Knowledge without practice decays. The human being does not become free because they have heard something true. They become free only when that truth has been carved into habit. And habit is not formed by inspiration. It is formed by discipline. Before the modern world turned self-improvement into motivation, before it replaced rigor with enthusiasm, Epictetus had already drawn the line. Freedom is not a gift. It is a trained capacity. Just as the body becomes strong through repeated strain, the mind becomes stable through repeated correction. There is no shortcut. There is no single realization that permanently transforms the soul. There is only practice. This is the first fracture. People believe that if they understand something deeply enough, they will automatically live according to it. They imagine that clarity produces change. But Epictetus rejects this illusion. He knows the mind is not governed by what it knows once. It is governed by what it does repeatedly. A person may agree with reason in the morning and betray it by evening, not because they are dishonest, but because their habits are stronger than their insights. This is why training becomes essential. The mind must be exercised, not occasionally, not when convenient, but constantly. Epictetus does not speak of philosophy as a set of ideas to admire. He treats it as a daily discipline, a form of internal conditioning. Every thought, every reaction, every judgment becomes material for training. The question is not whether you know what is right. The question is whether you have practiced it enough for it to remain when pressure arrives. Because pressure always arrives. This is where most people fail. They understand calmness in peace, but collapse in conflict. They value patience in theory, but lose it in frustration. They speak of detachment, but cling when loss appears. Their philosophy exists in abstraction, not in action. Epictetus refuses this separation. He insists that the mind must be trained under conditions that resemble real life. Not perfect conditions, not controlled environments, but situations where emotion rises, where discomfort appears, where desire pulls, where fear intrudes. This is where training becomes real. Now the second movement sharpens. Training the mind is not a vague process. It is structured, repeated, intentional. Epictetus describes practices that appear simple but are severe in their effect. Morning reflection, evening review, continuous self-observation. These are not rituals for comfort. They are tools for correction. In the morning, you prepare. You remind yourself that difficulty will come, that people will act irrationally, that events will not follow your preference. This is not pessimism. It is preparation. Because when the unexpected becomes expected, its impact weakens. You are no longer shocked by reality behaving like reality. In the evening, you review. You examine where you failed, where you reacted without thinking, where you allowed desire, anger, or fear to take control. This is not self-punishment. It is self-awareness. Because without review, the same errors repeat without being seen. This repetition builds something, not perfection, stability. A mind that has been trained begins to respond differently, not because it has eliminated emotion, but because it has practiced not surrendering to it. The gap between impression and reaction grows. The ability to pause strengthens. The habit of questioning inner impulses becomes natural. This is how freedom becomes embodied, not as a concept, but as a reflex shaped by discipline. Now bring this into the modern world. In 2025, people consume ideas constantly. They read, listen, watch, learn. But consumption is not transformation. Information flows, but behavior remains unchanged. Why? Because there is no training, no repetition, no structured effort to turn understanding into habit. This creates a dangerous illusion. People believe they are evolving because they are exposed to ideas, but exposure without practice produces only intellectual decoration. The mind becomes full, but not stable. It knows what to do, but does not do it consistently. Epictetus would see this as a failure of discipline. He would say that knowledge not applied is not neutral. It is wasted. And wasted knowledge creates frustration. Because the individual sees the gap between what they know and how they live, but lacks the structure to close it. This is where practice becomes unavoidable. The mind must be trained like the body. Repetition, correction, endurance, failure, adjustment, again and again. There is no other way. Now the deeper psychological layer appears. Why do people resist this kind of training? Because it is uncomfortable. It exposes weakness. It requires consistency without immediate reward. It forces the individual to confront their own patterns repeatedly. This is not exciting. It is exhausting. And the modern mind prefers stimulation over discipline. It wants quick results, immediate change, permanent transformation after a single realization. Epictetus destroys this expectation. He shows that real change is slow, not because the truth is weak, but because the mind is resistant. Habits formed over years do not dissolve in moments. They must be replaced through deliberate effort. This effort creates friction, and most people avoid friction. They retreat into distraction. They seek comfort. They postpone discipline. And in doing so, they remain unchanged. Epictetus does not allow this avoidance. He demands that the individual take responsibility for their own training, not occasionally, daily, because every day the mind is shaped, either by unconscious repetition or by conscious practice. There is no neutral state. You are always becoming something. The question is whether that becoming is directed or accidental. Through Epictetus, we see that calmness is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. Patience is not natural. It is cultivated. Detachment is not indifference. It is practiced clarity. The person who appears stable has not been spared difficulty. They have been trained by it. This is the difference. Now the final question emerges. Are you training your mind, or are you leaving it to be shaped by whatever happens? Are you practicing what you claim to value, or merely agreeing with it intellectually? Are you reviewing your actions, or repeating them unconsciously? Because without training, nothing holds. Insight fades. Emotion dominates. Habit takes over, and the life you intended to live remains theoretical. Epictetus leaves no room for illusion here. Freedom is not something you discover once. It is something you practice until it becomes part of you. And the moment you stop practicing, it begins to weaken, because the mind, like the body, returns to its default state without effort. And that default state is not freedom, it is impulse. So the path is clear, not easy, but clear. Train, repeat, correct, observe, again and again, until the way you think is no longer something you force, but something you are. And that is where discipline becomes identity, and identity becomes freedom. Freedom is not what we chase. It is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Long before modern psychology tried to map the mind, Epictetus had already exposed its deepest illusion, that suffering comes from the world, not from our attachment to it. He did not soften reality, he confronted it. He drew a brutal line between what is ours and what will never be ours, and demanded that we live inside that truth. First, he reveals that dignity is internal, not granted. The world can take status, wealth, even the body, but it cannot touch the will unless we surrender it. Most people misunderstand this, believing freedom requires control over circumstances. It does not. It requires control over response. And in that distinction, a new form of power emerges. Quiet, unbreakable, absolute. Second, he dismantles the illusion of control. We suffer not because life is chaotic, but because we insist it should not be. We demand permanence from what is designed to change. We cling to what was never ours. And when it collapses, we call it tragedy, when in truth, it is exposure. Exposure of our misplaced dependence. Today, nothing has changed, only the disguise. Technology accelerates comfort, but not clarity. We are still disturbed by the same mechanism, judgment. We still hand our peace to outcomes, to people, to things that were never under our command. Modern life did not solve this problem. It refined our ability to ignore it. And beneath all of this lies a harder truth. We fear responsibility more than suffering. Because to accept Epictetus is to accept that no one is coming to stabilize your inner world. No system, no person, no future version of yourself. Only discipline, only awareness, only the relentless act of choosing how to see. Epictetus stands as a symbol, not of comfort, but of confrontation. A slave who understood freedom more deeply than kings. Through him, we see the core of existence, that the battle is never outside. It is always within the boundary of our own judgment. All of it leads to one conclusion. Freedom is not the ability to keep what you love. It is the refusal to lose yourself when it is taken. And at that moment, there is nowhere left to hide from who you truly are.